My mother stood at the head of the dining room table, tapping her wine glass with a spoon like she was about to announce a merger instead of a wedding gift, and she looked directly at me when she said it. "Vivian, you'll cover Desmond's honeymoon. 45,000 for the Maldives resort, split between the two of you would be nothing, but since you have no kids anyway, you can just take the whole thing." The room went quiet except for the soft clinking of Desmond's fork against his plate, because even he wasn't brave enough to look up. I sat there in my mother's dining room, in the house my father built with his own 2 hands before cancer took him 6 years ago, and I felt something in my chest crack clean in half. I want you to understand what those words did to me before I tell you what I did back. 2 months before that dinner, my husband Theo and I had walked out of a fertility clinic in complete silence after our 4th round of IVF failed. We had spent $110,000 over 6 years chasing a heartbeat that never came. We had 2 miscarriages, one at 11 weeks and one at 19 weeks, the second one bad enough that I bled through a hospital gown while a nurse held my hand because Theo was stuck in traffic from work. My mother knew all of this. She had been in the waiting room for the first miscarriage. And now she stood at her dinner table, in front of my brother, his fiancé, and my husband, and used my empty arms as a punchline to justify why I should bankroll a honeymoon to a 5-star overwater bungalow in the Maldives. I said no, just that quiet and even, "No, Mom, I won't be paying for that." She set her wine glass down hard enough that it rang against the table, and she told me I was being selfish, that family takes care of family, that Desmond had sacrificed so much working under me all these years and deserved this. I looked at my husband, who reached under the table and squeezed my hand so tight I could feel his wedding ring against my knuckle, and I said it again. No. The next morning, at 9:15, I got an email from our company's HR portal, the same portal I had helped set up 11 years earlier when I redesigned our entire benefits structure. My health insurance had been terminated, effective immediately, citing restructuring of executive benefits allocation. My mother had canceled my health insurance less than 18 hours after I refused to fund my brother's honeymoon. I read that email 3 times standing in my kitchen in my robe, and something inside me that had been bending for years finally, quietly, snapped straight. To understand how we got to that dining room, you need to understand who we were as a family and what Callaway and Vance Insurance Partners actually was. My father, Walter Callaway, started that agency in a strip mall office in 1988 with his best friend Roland Vance, selling life insurance policies door to door before either of them had 2 nickels to rub together. By the time I was in college, it had grown into one of the most respected independent insurance agencies in the region, handling everything from commercial liability for mid-sized manufacturers to high net worth life and estate planning for families who had been with us for 3 generations. I joined the family business the year I graduated with my finance degree, not because my father pressured me, but because I genuinely loved the work, loved sitting across from a nervous young couple buying their first life insurance policy and watching their shoulders relax when I explained exactly what it meant for their future. My brother Desmond joined 2 years after me, mostly because my father asked him to, and mostly because Desmond had bounced between 3 different jobs and needed somewhere steady to land. I want to be fair here, because this story is not about painting my brother as a villain from page 1. Desmond was charming, likable, the kind of guy clients enjoyed having lunch with, and for years he did fine, not spectacular, but fine. I built my book of business the hard way, one relationship at a time, cold calling business owners at 6 in the morning before their staff arrived, showing up personally when a client had a claim dispute, even if it meant driving 2 hours on a Saturday. By the time my father passed away 6 years ago, I was personally responsible for bringing in nearly 70% of our agency's annual premium revenue, and every single one of my major clients had signed with me directly as their agent of record, a detail that would matter more than my mother ever imagined. When my father died, he left the agency in a complicated arrangement. My mother, Judith, became majority owner and chairwoman, largely because my father believed, wrongly as it turned out, that keeping her in charge would keep the family together. I became vice president of client relations and was licensed independently as a producer in our state, meaning legally. My book of business was tied to my personal license, not solely to the agency's corporate license. Desmond became vice president of new business development, a title that sounded impressive and mostly meant he took long lunches with prospects who rarely converted. My mother, grieving and suddenly thrust into a leadership role she never trained for, leaned harder into old patterns from our childhood, patterns where Desmond could do no wrong, and I was the responsible one who didn't need praise because I could handle things myself. I want to tell you about my mother's own history because it matters for what comes later in this story. My mother had 2 miscarriages of her own before she had Desmond, back in the early 80s when nobody talked about pregnancy loss, when doctors handed you a pamphlet and told you to try again. She never processed that grief. She buried it so deep that by the time I was going through my own losses decades later, she had convinced herself that the correct response to infertility was to simply move forward, to not wallow, as she once put it to me after my second miscarriage. Her coldness wasn't random cruelty. It was an old wound dressed up as tough love, and it took me a long time to understand that, but understanding it later didn't excuse what she did to me in that dining room or the morning after. The morning I discovered my insurance was canceled, I called my husband Theo at work, and I could hear him go completely silent on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that comes right before someone decides they're done being patient. Theo is an electrical engineer, steady and analytical, the kind of man who processes anger by making lists instead of yelling, and he simply said, "Vivian, I think it's time you talked to Priscilla." Priscilla Enkemdirim had been my mentor since my first year in the insurance business, an independent broker who ran her own small but thriving agency 2 towns over. And she had told me more than once over the years, half joking and half serious, that if I ever wanted to build something of my own, she'd be the first person to shake my hand on it. I called her that same afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the pharmacy, where I had gone to ask about COBRA continuation costs, and my voice was shaking when she picked up. Priscilla didn't say much at first. She let me talk, let me cry a little, let me explain what my mother had said at dinner and what she had done the next morning. Then she asked me one question that changed everything. "Vivian, whose name is on the agent of record forms for your major clients?" I told her mine, all of them. Every single major account I had built over 15 years had my personal producer license number attached, a standard practice in independent agencies, but one my mother, focused entirely on the corporate side of the business, had never fully understood the implications of. Priscilla explained something to me that afternoon that I hadn't fully considered before. Because I was independently licensed, and because those clients had a contractual relationship with me as their agent of record and not solely with Callaway and Vance as a corporate entity, I had every legal right, if those clients chose to follow me, to transfer their policies to a new agency, provided I did it ethically, provided I never disparaged my old company, and provided I gave clients honest, complete information and let them make their own decision. I spent the next several days doing something I never thought I would do. I called an employment attorney, a careful, precise woman named Odalise Ferreira, who reviewed my employment contract line by line. She found what I suspected but hadn't dared hope for. My contract explicitly stated that group health benefits were a condition of continued executive employment and could not be altered, except through formal board review with 30 days written notice to the affected executive. My mother had violated my contract the moment she canceled my insurance overnight with no notice and no board review, and Odalise told me plainly that this breach released me from the narrow non-solicitation clause that would have otherwise restricted me from bringing clients to a new firm. I remember sitting in her office, my hands folded in my lap, feeling something unfamiliar move through my chest. It wasn't rage anymore. It was clarity. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not immediately decide to destroy my family's business. That was never the plan, and if you're expecting a story where I burned everything to the ground out of spite, that's not who I am and it's not what happened. What I decided, sitting in that lawyer's office, was simpler and quieter than revenge. I decided I was done being treated as the family's free resource, the daughter who didn't need protecting because she could handle anything, the daughter whose pain was apparently worth less than her brother's honeymoon. I decided that if my mother wanted to treat me as expendable, I would go build something where I wasn't. Priscilla and I met for coffee 3 days later, and by the end of that meeting, we had a rough handshake agreement to open a new firm together, one where I would come in as a full partner, not an employee, my name directly on the door alongside hers. We called it Enkemdirim and Callaway Advisory Partners. I remember writing my own name on that partnership agreement for the first time and feeling my hands actually tremble, not from fear, but from something closer to relief. Over the following 6 weeks, I did something that I want to describe carefully, because I think it's important to understand I did nothing improper, nothing illegal, and nothing dishonest. I did not poach clients through lies or manipulation. I simply reached out, one by one, to the business owners and families I had personally served for years, people who called me directly whenever they had a claim, people whose kids' college funds I had helped structure, people who trusted me specifically, not the Callaway name in the abstract. I told each of them the truth in broad strokes, that I was transitioning to a new firm, that I would be personally continuing to serve their accounts if they chose to come with me, and that if they preferred to stay with Callaway and Vance, I respected that completely and would ensure a smooth handoff. I never once mentioned the dinner, the honeymoon, or the insurance. I never disparaged my mother or my brother to a single client. I simply gave people the facts and let them choose, and overwhelmingly, quietly, one after another, they chose me. By the 8th week, 41 of my 53 major accounts had signed transfer paperwork to move their agent of record designation to Enkemdirim and Callaway. That represented, by my calculations, somewhere around 62% of the total premium revenue that Callaway and Vance had processed the previous fiscal year. I did not celebrate when the transfers went through. I remember sitting at my new desk, a simple second-hand oak desk Priscilla had found at an estate sale, looking at the confirmation emails, and feeling a strange grief alongside the relief. Grief for the company my father built. Grief for what my family had become that it drove me to this point at all. I found out how bad things had gotten at Callaway and Vance through Desmond, of all people, 3 months after the dinner. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and he'd broken our father's car window playing baseball in the driveway. "Vivian, we need to talk. Mom's losing her mind. The Hendricks account is gone, the Whitfield manufacturing account is gone, 3 of our biggest commercial clients just transferred out in the same month, and the accountant says if this keeps up we won't make payroll by the end of the quarter." I sat there on my back porch, phone pressed to my ear, and I felt no satisfaction, only a heavy, tired sadness, and I told him simply, "Desmond, I think you and Mom need to come see me. In person. This weekend." They arrived at my house that Saturday morning, my mother in her good coat like she was attending a funeral, Desmond looking like he hadn't slept in days. Theo made coffee and then quietly excused himself to the garage, giving us space, though I could tell from the set of his jaw that he wanted to stay and defend me. My mother sat stiffly on my living room sofa, the same sofa she had helped me pick out when Theo and I bought this house, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between fear and fury. "Why is our business going bankrupt, Vivian? What did you do?" I want to walk you through exactly how that conversation unfolded, because it is the hinge point of this entire story. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I set a folder on my coffee table, the same folder Odalise Ferreira had helped me prepare, and I opened it slowly. "I didn't do anything to you, Mom. I simply stopped doing everything for you." I explained calmly that I was independently licensed, that my clients had chosen to follow me of their own free will after I gave them the honest option to do so, that I had broken no laws and no ethical rules of my profession. I explained that my employment contract had been violated the moment my insurance was canceled without board review or notice, which released me from any obligation to protect the agency's interests over my own. My mother's face went through several colors while I spoke, and Desmond just stared at the floor, his hands pressed flat against his knees. Then I said the thing I had been holding in my chest for 3 months, the thing underneath all the legal explanations. "Mom, you told me, in front of my husband and my brother's fiancé, that I had no kids anyway, like that was a resource you were entitled to spend. You have no idea what those words did to me. Theo and I lost 2 pregnancies. We spent our entire savings trying to have a baby and failing. And 2 months after our last failed round, you didn't ask me how I was doing. You asked me to write a check for a honeymoon, and when I said no, you punished me by taking away my health insurance, the exact thing I might have needed for another round of treatment." My mother's face crumpled in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not even at my father's funeral, and for a long moment, nobody in that room said anything at all. It was Desmond, surprisingly, who broke first. He put his face in his hands and said, in a voice thick with something that sounded like shame, "Vivian, there's something else you don't know, and Mom doesn't fully know it either, not the whole truth." He explained, haltingly, that 6 months before that dinner, he had made a significant underwriting error on a commercial policy for one of our longtime manufacturing clients, an error that had left a serious coverage gap. And when that client suffered a warehouse fire 2 months later, the gap meant the claim was disputed, and the client was threatening litigation against the agency. Desmond had been terrified of losing his job, terrified of disappointing our mother, and instead of coming clean about his mistake, he had thrown himself into the wedding planning and the elaborate honeymoon as a distraction. And part of the pressure to have me fund it, pressure he now admitted he should have pushed back against, came from his own desperate need to look successful and settled in our mother's eyes while his professional world was quietly falling apart. My mother sat there absorbing this, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, the golden child image she had built of Desmond cracking right alongside her image of me as the daughter who never needed tending. She looked between the two of us, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she looked genuinely lost, not controlling, not sharp, just a woman realizing she had built her family on assumptions that were mostly wrong. "I didn't know about the fire claim," she said quietly. "I didn't know about your miscarriages being that recent. I didn't know any of it, because I stopped asking either of you real questions years ago, and I'm so ashamed of that right now I can barely look at either of you. I want to be clear that this moment, painful as it was, is not where the story ends, because a single confession over coffee does not undo years of harm, and I was not willing to simply forgive and forget because my mother finally cried in my living room. I told her that directly. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but that an apology in a moment of financial crisis was not the same as real change, and that I needed to see something different before I would even consider helping repair what was broken at Callaway and Vance. She asked me, her voice small, what that would look like, and I told her I needed to think about it, and I asked her and Desmond to leave so I could have space to figure out what I actually wanted, not just react to a room full of tears. Over the following 2 weeks, I talked it through extensively with Theo and with Priscilla. Theo, ever the engineer, helped me think through it like a systems problem, not just an emotional one. What would actual accountability look like, structurally, not just verbally? He asked me one night at the kitchen table, and that question became the foundation for everything that followed. I realized I didn't want to simply watch my family's company collapse out of spite, because underneath everything, it was still the company my father built with his hands. And Desmond, whatever his failures, was still my brother. And my mother, whatever her cruelty, was still grieving a husband and drowning in a role she was never equipped for. But I also was never again going to be the family's invisible safety net, expected to give endlessly and receive nothing, not respect, not honesty, not even basic care during the hardest years of my life. I called my mother and asked her to set up a formal meeting, not a family dinner, an actual business meeting with an outside mediator present, someone neither of us had a relationship with. She agreed immediately, which itself told me something had genuinely shifted in her. We met 3 weeks later in a conference room at a business mediation firm, my mother, Desmond, myself, and a mediator named Farrokh Ose, who specialized in family business disputes. I laid out my conditions clearly. Conditions I had spent 2 weeks writing and rewriting with Theo's help and Odalis's legal review. First, I told them if I was to consider bringing any clients back or merging my new firm's resources with Callaway and Vance in any way, it would only be as a full equity partner, with my name on the ownership documents, reflecting the actual revenue I had always generated. Aided not as an employee subject to another arbitrary decision by my mother. Second, I required a formal, written apology, not just to me privately, but acknowledged openly to the extended family and to Theo directly, since he had witnessed the original comment and deserved to hear my mother take responsibility for it in front of others, not just behind closed doors. Third, I required my mother to attend grief counseling, not as a punishment, but because I told her plainly that a woman who buried 2 miscarriages in the 80s and never processed that pain was going to keep hurting the people around her until she dealt with it. And I loved her enough, still, somewhere underneath all my anger, to want her to actually heal rather than just apologize and repeat the pattern in 5 years. Fourth, and this one surprised even Desmond, I required that he formally disclose the underwriting error and the pending litigation risk to the agency's board and to our mother in full detail, with a remediation plan reviewed by an outside compliance consultant, and that he complete a structured coaching and licensing recertification program before he was permitted to handle any commercial accounts independently again. Fifth, I required a written family agreement, drafted by Odalis and reviewed by their own attorney, explicitly stating that no family member's benefits, compensation, or employment terms could ever again be altered as retaliation for a personal disagreement, with real consequences written into the bylaws if that ever happened again. My mother listened to every single condition without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "That's fair, Vivian. That's more than fair, actually, and I think I knew, somewhere, that I needed someone to force me to look at myself, because I clearly wasn't going to do it on my own." Desmond nodded along with her, and he added something I hadn't expected, that he wanted to personally apologize to Theo as well, man to man, for staying silent at that dinner table when he should have spoken up for me. The following months were not a straight line toward healing, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories that pretend reconciliation is easy do a disservice to anyone actually living through something like this. There were setbacks. My mother missed her second grief counseling appointment and had to be gently but firmly reminded by her own therapist that healing required consistency, not just good intentions. Desmond struggled through his recertification coursework, frustrated and humbled by material he had breezed past years earlier, and there was one difficult phone call where he admitted to me he almost quit the program entirely out of shame before Theo, of all people, talked him through it over beers on our back porch. But slowly, month by month, the pieces started holding. My mother's formal apology happened at a family gathering 4 months after that mediation meeting. At a dinner she hosted specifically for the purpose, not disguised as a birthday or holiday, but announced plainly as a dinner where she needed to say something important. She stood at the same table where she had made that cruel comment months earlier, and this time she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I said something to Vivian in this room that I am deeply ashamed of." I used her grief over losing 2 pregnancies as a justification to demand money from her, and then I punished her for saying no by taking away something as basic as her health insurance. That was cruel, and it was wrong, and it came from my own unprocessed pain that I took out on the daughter who had spent her whole life taking care of everyone but herself. "Vivian, I am sorry, and Theo, I am sorry you had to witness me hurt your wife and say nothing to stop myself. Theo, sitting beside me, simply nodded, his hand finding mine under the table, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for the better part of a year. Desmond's apology to Theo came separately, over that beer on our back porch I mentioned, and it was less formal but somehow more genuine for it, Desmond admitting plainly that he had let his own fear of failure make him complicit in something he knew was wrong the moment it happened, and that he respected Theo for how steady he had stayed through the whole ordeal. Theo, never a man of many words, simply said, "We're family, Desmond. Family means you show up right, not just show up." And the two of them shook hands like something had actually been settled between them. The restructuring of the agency took the better part of 8 months to finalize. Odalys and my mother's attorney worked through drafts of a new partnership agreement that reflected reality rather than old assumptions. And eventually, Callaway and Vance Insurance Partners was reborn as Callaway Family Partners, with a new ownership structure giving me 45% equity, my mom, our 30%, Desmond 15%, and Roland Vance's surviving family retaining their original 10% stake. Priscilla and I made the decision, after long conversations, to keep Engkemdirim and Callaway Advisory Partners operating as its own separate firm rather than fully dissolving it into the family business. Because I had learned something important about myself in the process of building it, namely that I needed something in my professional life that was mine alone, built on my own terms, regardless of how the family situation resolved. But I did agree to personally return as co-CEO of Callaway Family Partners 3 days a week, bringing back a portion of my larger accounts who wanted to return to the original agency's broader service offerings, while keeping my core client relationships and my ownership stake at Priscilla's firm intact. Desmond completed his recertification program with genuine effort in the final months, and the disputed claim from the warehouse fire was eventually settled through mediation, at a cost to the agency, but nowhere near the catastrophic litigation that had once terrified him into silence. He came to me afterward, on his own, without our mother present, and told me something that stuck with me. I used to think being the favorite meant I didn't have to be good at this job, that Mom would protect me no matter what I did. Watching everything almost fall apart taught me that being protected isn't the same as being respected, and I'd rather earn the second one. I told him I was proud of him for saying that, and I meant it. My mother's grief counseling continued for over a year, and somewhere around month 6, she called me one evening, crying in a way that had nothing to do with business or apologies, just crying about the 2 babies she lost in 1982 and 1984 and never once let herself properly mourn. Babies she had never even named because a doctor once told her it was better not to get attached to what wasn't meant to be. I sat on the phone with her for 2 hours that night, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was talking to my actual mother, not the chairwoman, not the family matriarch performing control to hide her fear. Just a woman who had been hurting quietly for 40 years and finally let someone see it. There is one more piece of this story I need to tell you, because I promised you the truth, all of it, including the parts that feel almost too tender to say out loud. 11 months after that dinner, where my mother demanded I fund my brother's honeymoon, Theo and I decided to try one more round of fertility treatment, our 5th attempt, funded this time in part by a genuinely unexpected gesture. Desmond and his wife Selene, who had married in a scaled-down ceremony with a modest week-long trip to a lakeside cabin instead of the original Maldives honeymoon, a change they made entirely on their own once they understood the full weight of what that extravagance had cost our family, quietly transferred $15,000 into an account for Theo and me, with a card that simply said, "For the family we hope you get to build. We love you both." I cried reading that card in a way I hadn't cried in years, not from grief this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. That 5th round of IVF worked. I am currently 7 months pregnant as I tell you this story, and Theo cries almost weekly at things as small as watching the nursery paint dry. And my mother, the same woman who once told me my empty arms made me an appropriate source of honeymoon funding, has been to every single prenatal appointment with me that her schedule allows, sitting quietly in waiting rooms doing crossword puzzles and asking the ultrasound technician more questions than I do. She started a small fund at Callaway Family Partners, without my asking, offering paid fertility treatment leave to any employee who needs it, named quietly in the employee handbook simply as the Walter Callaway Family Support Policy, after my father, though everyone in the family knows exactly which of her daughters inspired it. Desmond and Selene are due with their own first child 4 months after mine, a detail that once would have felt like unbearable comparison and now simply feels like a family growing back together in its own uneven, honest way. We have dinner most Sundays now, at my mother's house, the same dining room where she once tapped a wine glass and demanded I bankroll a honeymoon I could barely afford emotionally to think about. And it is a different room now, not because the furniture changed, but because the people sitting in it finally learned how to actually see each other. I think about that email from HR canceling my insurance sometimes, and I no longer feel the hot flash of anger it once gave me. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because that single cruel act was the exact thing that forced me to stop quietly absorb by every ounce of my family's dysfunction and finally demand to be treated as an equal, not an endless resource. My mother did not lose her business because I wanted revenge. She lost the version of her business built on my silent, uncompensated sacrifice, and what grew back in its place was something sturdier, something built on actual accountability instead of assumption, something that finally had room for all of us, my mother's grief, my brother's fear, my own long private ache for a child, all of it out in the open where it could finally, actually heal. If you have ever been the responsible one in your family, the one who is expected to give and give because you're seen as strong enough to handle it, I hope this reminds you that being strong does not mean you have to be endlessly available for people who won't extend you the same care in return. Setting a boundary is not betrayal. Sometimes it is the only thing that finally forces the people who love you to see you clearly. And sometimes, if you are patient and if they are willing to actually do the work, it is the very thing that saves the family instead of destroying it.